Hello and welcome. Dominic Hale here for Mining Journal. Today we've collected a panel of experts together to talk about mine closure. Our panelists are well versed in all things mine closure related, and it's set to be an illuminating discussion. We have for you Mike Okane, Senior Technical Advisor at Okane Consultants. We also have Jeff Parshley, Mine Closure Corporate Consultant at SRK Consulting, and Malcolm Shang, Global Head of Mine Closure Planning and Circular Economy for ArcelorMittal. Gentlemen, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
I want to kick off proceedings by asking each of you to provide a brief headline account of how you think the mine closure space has changed. What are the chief differences now than if we were having this conversation, say, 10 or even 5 years ago? Mike, if you could start us off, please.
Well, I think 5 or 10 years ago, we would have been thinking about whether or not we're costing mine closure appropriately. And it was a great focus, and remains a great focus. This is one of the things that Jeff is I would argue one of the leading expert in the world on this is actual closure costs and being realistic about it. And I think that the change now is that I see is that there's an incredibly strong focus on being an integrated mine planning and closure planning focus. And, I have a particular definition of that. I think integrated also means not multidisciplinary, but interdisciplinary. So, for example, if I'm not a geochemist, I'm a geotechnical engineer. And interdisciplinary means I need to move to the geochemist and make sure I understand their language. So I'm incorporating them so that there's no one piece of the closure plan or the mine plan that's more important than the other. And then the other aspect that I think is a significant difference is the difference between consultation, engagement, collaboration, and true co-development and partnership with Indigenous peoples and First Nations. I think rightly so that the focus on land and land with the big L, meaning flora, fauna, water, and land stewardship is coming into mine closure. And I think it's the right time, and it's about time. So I think those are the two things that I would say are big changes.
Jeff, what do you think have been the most noteworthy developments?
Well, first of all, I agree with some of what Mike said. Certainly, we really were starting to understand the importance of getting the closure costs, the rights, beginning probably in the early 2000s, but certainly by the time the investment community really got engaged during the super cycle, that really kicked off the hard thinking about what this really costs. And I still think there's work to be done, in particular in that space, understanding the true cost of post-closure management on sites. I think we still tend to look at it in a net present value perspective, and it tends to minimize what that real impact is financially in the long haul. But I think interesting that Mike said interdisciplinary rather than multidisciplinary. I'll have to give some thought to using that term going forward, Mike, and I'll credit you at least for a while coming up with that. But it's always been one of the things I've loved most about mine closure work. I've been doing it for over 30 years now. And one of the things that got me hooked on it right away was the fact I'm a geologist. I needed to work with engineers and biologists and water quality specialists and just about every discipline we do. And I think probably by 10 years ago, we understood that fairly well. I think the part that we were still struggling with, and maybe we could say we're probably are in that space still to some degree today, is incorporating sort of the non-engineering, non-science side of the whole mine closure thing. And, when we're dealing with things like chemistry and the laws of physics and engineering and numbers, it's pretty easy. When you start incorporating people in it and how they interact with the land, it gets really complicated really fast. I think that's probably, and it's been the area I've been focusing on probably for the last 10, 15 years, is trying to understand the whole concept of what the ICMM refers to as social transitioning. I think that term is not quite, it's better than what we used to use, but it's not quite there. It's really socioeconomic transitioning, because it takes the whole social context, the things that Mike was talking about, but puts the other layer on top of that, and that's the economic context. And transitioning a community or a group of people from a mining context to a post-mining context is a difficult thing. It is fraught with misunderstanding and unrealistic expectations. And I think the key to that is integrating and avoiding siloing the technical side with the socioeconomic side of mine closure, and getting better at communicating with stakeholders, including communities and nowadays investors as well.
And Malcolm, how are things looking different today in your view?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of the comments by Mike and Jeff, especially the interdisciplinary approach that's required. One point I will make, I think the biggest difference that I've seen over the last, I guess, 5 to 10 years is really moving away from just purely compliance to actually looking at, I guess, long-term liability minimization. And then now more recently, even though it's been in the space for a while, really looking at ways of actually maximizing the value of the assets on the site, as well as the site itself for potential post-closure land use. The other thing I'll add is that we've spoken about it for a while in terms of integrated closure planning. I think it's starting to be at least started. The discussion has been started to try and evolve it to an involved mine planning rather than a separate closure planning exercise. And I think that's really where we need to go. I think it really will help, I guess, minimize a lot of the potential long-term liabilities long-term if we identify problems early enough, and then actually look at ways of minimizing those issues through mine design. And also looking at, I guess, more holistic valorization of potential commodities within the site. So one thing I think is still peculiar these days is that mining companies are very specific in terms of the commodities of interest that they go after. We don't spend as much time and effort, in my mind, in terms of exploring the waste portion, if you want to call it, of the ore resource, in terms of potential commercial value as well as potential societal value. And I think that approach is starting to be discussed, and I'm really excited to see where that potentially can go.
Look, that's a great overview from the three of you. Thank you for that introduction. Jeff, to what extent is there consensus then within the industry as to what integrated mine closure planning actually means? Has the industry been late to the party on this, or has it for a long time understood the importance of that integrated approach throughout the life cycle?
Well, first of all, let me say, I think it's really important that we are careful not to paint the entire industry with the same broad brush. Certain companies, certain mining operations, certain jurisdictions have actually been doing this for quite some time. Others are just now coming to the party, no doubt, or at least they're on the steeper part of the learning curve. Mm-hmm. But there are certain jurisdictions in the world, some in Canada, certainly the United States, that have been, had laws in place requiring mine closure planning as early as the 1970s. However, probably in those first decade, maybe even decade and a half, 2 decades, it really wasn't understood very well. And it was only when we started closing modern mines in the early 1980s that people started understanding, okay, maybe this is a little more complicated than we thought. And in the 90s, there were even conferences on designing for mine closure. We talked about it all the time. We weren't doing it, if we're honest about it. But during the super cycle, I know that several of our big clients, some of the major companies, brought us to the table as they were developing, new projects or major expansions. They brought a closure person to the table. We sat next to the tailings engineers, and we actually had a lot of input into the design. In several instances, our input actually resulted in significant design changes for various facilities or placements. So it really was in some parts of the industry, it was really being looked at by the mid 2000s. And I think that, you know, there are other parts of the industry, other jurisdictions in the world that are still grappling with that. And hopefully those who are leading can pull the other folks along a lot faster than those of us who plowed the original ground.
Interesting. I mean, Mike, does it need more meat on the bones, this integrated definition, or perhaps to be more clearly understood or better communicated to become a useful driver of change, or a flag around which everybody can rally and be inspired by? What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, I do think, you know, I do think, you know, characterizing it, you know, more meat on the bone is that there's, you know, there's a difference between a statement about being integrated and then, as what Jeff talks about, the how and the doing of it, right? And I'll give you a very simple example, a recent one where the mining company had a very robust closure plan. And there were people on site who were really thinking about closure and water quality. The mine plan existed, and there was material that was being stockpiled that would be used for closure works, cover material, landform design material. But when you looked at it, and there was a commitment in the closure plan and in the permitting to place a cover system to manage metal leaching and acid rock drainage. However, the mine plan moved the material and stockpiled it. The closure plan didn't include costs to take that material and place it and put it on the mine rock stockpile. So Jeff is smiling because it's, you know, he knows this is the most common miss with mine plans and the costing, right? So that's occurring. To me, that's an example of not being fully integrated, right? It's being talking about it, but if you're integrated, you're going to say, I want to do whatever I can do, as Malcolm says, one plan, so that I move the material, most of the material once, and I have full confidence that when I've moved it, the way I'm moving it, the way I'm placing it, how I'm placing it, why I'm placing it is connected between the mine plan and the closure plan. So that if I do have to move it again, it's eyes wide open about what that means to closure costs and potentially performance and production and all that kind of stuff, right? So I think there's the how, and then there's people sitting around the table being able to influence to a stronger and greater extent. You know, at mine sites, it's production and it's geotechnical stability. And usually with closure, there's, you know, the environment, the social aspects of it. And there's a bigger seat at the table to be made for that integrated approach, so that everyone has that equal say to influence, you know, costs over the whole entire mine life cycle, so that we're doing our best to only move the material once, and we completely understand why we're moving that material once. Or if it's twice, that's great, but we're all on the same page that we're bearing that risk, and we agree that that's the risk profile that we're going to move forward.
Do you see progress, Malcolm, on that front? Are folk walking the walk rather than just talking the talk?
I think, like Jeff mentioned, the spectrum of companies in terms of their maturity, in terms of closure planning and integrated closure planning. Some companies are definitely further along the journey than others. I think there's still a lot of work to do, especially echoing some of Mike's comments about the, I guess, integration piece in terms of closure planning within mine planning. Again, I would like it to eventually become just an evolved way of doing mine planning, and I think there's a key educational piece there that probably needs to start in the universities in terms of you need combined skill sets, and I think this is the key. Right now we have different specialists coming to the table and trying to influence the essentially the mine plan, which eventually ends up being the closure plan when the site is closed. If we can have more, I guess, interdisciplinary skilled mine planners and people within the company that are part of the decision-making process up front during the design phase and execution, I think we'll have better outcomes. I also think that the educational piece also extends higher up to executive and upper management. I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding in terms of the potential risks of closure and not closing properly and not minimizing liabilities to a company, as well as also potential missed opportunities in terms of actually, like I mentioned, post-closure land uses for the land, which can not just help a company's reputation, but also actually may increase the chances of relinquishment, the dream scenario for many companies, which I know is a rarity still internationally.
Dominic, do you mind if sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt, do you
sure.
mind if I add something there? Because Malcolm just mentioned something that reminded me of, is that, and it speaks to what we're talking about, which is that, you know, something is not in a mine plan, a life of mine plan, then it doesn't get done, right? So it's not the mine planner's fault, you know, that something is not going done and being integrated with closure. It's us as closure planning practitioners to be the champions on a site, to continue to push and communicate, to educate, to bring this in. And as I said, this interdisciplinary move to them, understand how they and what drives them, right? Production, geotechnical stability, cost, and say, I need to figure out how to get the closure planning importance and the closure works importance into their plans. When it's in their plans, then it will be done. We don't not do progressive closure works because nobody cares. It's because it's not part of the plan. And we have not communicated the value. And it's our job to work with others to help communicate that value so that it becomes part of the plan.
So in terms of, sorry, go on, Malcolm.
No, I was just going to add on to Mike's comment there. Essentially, my sort of view of it is that it's really about bringing the entire picture in terms of risks, opportunities, and also costs to the table in terms of what it actually takes to mine. If you ignore closure and you just look at the short-term risks, costs, it drives very different decision making. I think if you bring the bigger picture, you may end up with different decisions being made, and I think that's another key piece that Mike is indirectly speaking about and implying.
We're talking about optimizing on the industry side, though, but in terms of bridging that gap between managing expectations for stakeholders and for industry, to what extent are companies in sync with stakeholders, whether that's local communities or employees, regulators, government, shareholders, customers, as to what successful outcomes should look like? What's top of the wish list for each in your view, Jeff?
Well, you know, I as I said in my initial comments, I think the biggest challenge we have, I think that if you, I'm sure that if you asked many of the people in the industry, they would tell you that the industry's come a long way and we're doing quite well when it comes to mine closure. I think if you talk to communities that have been affected or are facing a closure of a mine in their community, I think they would probably tell you something different. I don't think that it's necessary that either is wrong. It's just that what the industry understands and knows has not been communicated in a way that the other stakeholders can actually understand. You know, Malcolm nailed the language of the executive suite: risk, money, right? Risk and cost. Those are the two things that drive it. And there's various kinds of risks, including, you know, stakeholder perception risks, but that's the language you need to talk to the mining company with. But that's not how you talk to the principal of a school who's going to see his funding go down because you're closing a mine, and the mine was providing a fair amount of the local taxes to fund that program, or the traditional people who have lived on that land and want to see it back to something that you know, they can once again claim as being, you know, part of their traditional land area. I think we're good technicians. I think we really struggle with how we communicate those things. We assume that since we understand the technical side, we understand the financial side, if we can just convey that to these people, they'll understand because it's a good thing. because we understand that it's a good thing. Doesn't work that way. They're not going to understand that. And until we get a grip on that and start speaking in a language that they understand and communicating, openly and honestly, of what the limitations are, what can and can't be done, I think we're going to continue to struggle as an industry dealing with those things.
Well, how would you propose overcoming that obstacle? Do you think we need different folk doing the communicating? Do we need to educate the communities more on the technical side of things to make it more palatable and so that they're cognizant of why things are happening as they are? What's your proposal in a nutshell?
Everything you just said, Dominic. We need to teach the good technical people who understand that side of it how to talk the other language. We need the people that know how to speak that other language. We have to teach them how to, what the issues around the technical issues, the financial issues are, and help and work together. One of the biggest challenges I think we've had, and it's been something I've been struggling with some of my colleagues for 20 years, is what I referred to at the beginning of siloing our socioeconomic group and our technical teams. They should not be doing separate things. Mike is absolutely right. This needs to be integrated, and I think that's the biggest disconnect that we still have in the industry. We're getting better at it. I'm certainly working with a number of clients right now as part of their communications team on closure, and we're having to teach these communications people what closure is about and what is realistic, and because often they'll end up simply by the questions they ask, they'll create expectations that just are not realistic. And I think that we need to teach the technical people how to speak the language of the people. We need to teach the stakeholder engagement, community relations people. We need to teach them about closure, and they need to be working side by side. They need to be completely integrated with one another. Without that, I think we're going to continue to struggle in this particular area.
Mike, are you optimistic that things are moving in the right direction? All the ingredients would seem to be there. It would appear to be a communication issue. Does that concur with your thoughts on it, or do you see other fundamental obstacles, be they related to regulation or an absence of the appropriate technologies? What's your take on that?
Well, I've never been accused of not being optimistic, Dominic. I'm always optimistic. Sometimes people will say I'm too optimistic, but I would say that I have faith, so I'm optimistic. But I also have I'm not too bad at trying to face the ugly truths right in the face and think about them and deal with them. So I think for me it's like what repeating what Jeff said, agreeing with you. There's all those things. One of the things that I think is very, very simple that can make a change today is terminology. And I'll just give two examples of that. One, I think it's a story. I know Malcolm has heard me say this, and so I apologize. It's a bit repetitive. But I was in a meeting 10, 12 years ago and presenting to community and Indigenous peoples about a project. And it was, like Jeff says, all the technical stuff, right? All the great stuff. We're going to, water quality and all that kind of stuff. And it was about building a mine rock stockpile, or I called it at the time a waste rock dump, with source term control. So we didn't have to rely on cover systems and collection and treatment as much. At the break, an elder came to me and he said, Mike, you seem like a trusting guy. Sounds like you know what you're doing, but can you please stop calling my ancestors waste? The rock that you're going to mine and you're planning to mine, I'm not opposed to the mine, but that rock is part of that mount is part of our creation story. It's not waste. So please come up with a different name. Now, one of the things that needs to be recognized is what incredible leadership by this gentleman, right? He took me aside one-to-one. He could have called me out in front of a bunch of people, right? So that's like amazing forgiveness, right? Right? True compassion. Right after that day I started, I'm never going to call a waste rock dump a waste rock dump again. For me, it always will ever be a mine rock stockpile. It's not waste, right? The second story I think I'll use, that's the importance of terminology, is I'm absolutely not a fan of alternative land use, post-mining land use, and for sure not end land use. People have been on the land for thousands and thousands of years. They've actually mined the land for tools. There's evidence in Canada 10,000 years ago. They've been on the land. We are then using this land for the mine. And we want to think about what's the next best future land use. Just transitioning, continuing land stewardship. And if we think about the future land use, the returning land use, and think about not using terms like waste, because that land actually means something to the people in which we're actually working on, I think that's something simple that will change today in your connection and communication of being able to work together and not just collaborate, but truly co-develop and partner.
Would you agree with that, Malcolm? That in terms of building trust and displaying empathy and a real understanding of the conditions at play for the affected communities?
I think it's critical, and it's definitely becoming a much more, I guess, much more important aspect in terms of not just closure planning, but mining in general. In terms of that, I think you don't really get to a workable solution unless you've actually engaged and considered the different points of view. I know there's definitely different perspectives from different stakeholders in terms of what people are aiming for, but I do think there's a potential commonality that we can come to. On the one side, the mining company would like obviously reduced risk, minimal cost where possible, improved reputation, and then eventually relinquishment. On the other side, the communities and the regional planners may actually be willing to get to that part of relinquishment, but with a compromise in some way in terms of what we achieve at the end of the mine life and what the future sort of for the use of the land actually is. I think that's where we can improve as an industry. We're not the best in terms of working across different industries and exploring other potential options, as well as I guess including within the closure planning process some really good key stakeholders like regional planners, more, etc. I think once we understand that bigger picture, potential other opportunities actually can come about. This isn't purely a closure piece, but I will use it as an example from, I'm a big fan of circularity, as Mike and Jeff probably know, but one of the aspects in terms of circularity that I like is that, like Mike says, there's nothing really in terms of waste. Like an old professor of mine used to say, there's no such thing as waste. It's just resources in the wrong place, wrong time, wrong space, right? Or state. And that sort of mindset changes everything, whether you look at materials on a site or the site itself, as well as how you develop the mine as you progress. One example, what I was going to speak about in terms of circularity, one thing it does force you to do is start to look at things from different scales. And one example is in Chile right now. I think it's one of the big tire companies, or a couple of them, are actually looking at investing in a tire recycling facility in a mining dense region of Chile. Now, the interesting thing from a purely business perspective, if you looked at each site individually, that business case would not be there. This company has looked at the region as a potential source of new material from recycled mine tires, which solves a big issue for the mining companies, and has actually now started to invest in a facility there. And I think those types of approaches and more innovative collaborations and ideas can really help move the industry forward, which would also improve, Mike won't like this word, but the post-closure land use for not just the site, but for the region. So I'm quite excited to see where that goes and that type of thinking. But I think we really do need more interdisciplinary engagement, not just within the mining side, but also across industries and with the different players within a region that are key decision makers, whether it is regulations or funding.
Well, reframing the whole narrative from opportunity as opposed to a cost to be borne or minimized is really fascinating stuff. I wonder whether you guys think that these ad hoc examples that are non-representative of the industry as a whole, could you come up with dozens of these examples, such as the Chile one, or are these few and far between? Do you think the industry is coming to a place where it's seeing mine closure as opportunity in that sort of broad psychological shift? What would you say, Jeff?
Well, first of all, I think Malcolm's example wasn't the mining industry coming up with an idea. It was another industry coming up with an idea that basically would solve a problem that the mining industry has, but on a larger scale. As we all know, the people we typically work with are the ones on the mines. Their focus tends to be the mine. It's hard to get them to look outside of that. You're more likely to get that support from, the corporate office, seeing the bigger picture and multi assets. I'm with Mike. I've been accused of being an optimist. I have faith in the industry. I've seen what we've accomplished in the last 30 plus years in this space. And so I have no doubt that we're doing it. People are asking that question, but I think, for many years in certain parts of the world, we dealt with basically a colonial attitude toward a mine. A mine would come in, particularly in areas that were remote or lacked a lot of infrastructure. Mine would come in, they would build the mine, they would build the town, they would build the school, they would build the clinics, they would build everything, and they would fund it all. Now, what happens when those mines close? There's an expectation, many of those are long-lived mines, and for generations, people have been working at the mine's taking care of them. What happens when it closes? There is such a level of paternalism that was created during the life of the mine and the way the mine took care of the community that the community will struggle without the mine. Dad and his bank account have left. What do we do? And so whatever future use you're going to have for the mine needs to be looked at very carefully. And one of the key things that I don't think we've really come to grips with is, where does the mining company's responsibility end? Obviously, once you pin that one down, it may be that they choose to continue to be involved beyond that point. But if you're looking at some type of alternative parallel economies, things like that, at what point in a mine closure project does the mining company's responsibility end and somebody else's start? And Germany, the German government, when they reunified back in the early 90s, they had to take over all of the old non-profitable coal mines in East Germany. And they spent somewhere, last I talked to them, I think they've said they were going to spend a total of $11 billion closing those. And what the government decided was, we will create a safe environment. We will put it into a condition that somebody can redevelop a land use, but we're not going to be responsible for funding that. And, I think that's a pretty reasonable model. But to get to that point, they obviously had to work with lots of other people who had ideas of what that future use might be, and were willing to invest the time and money to get there. And obviously working with the local communities and the other stakeholders, like the employees and, all of the businesses that grew up around those mines. So, I think that's a big question we have to address. Where does, from a socioeconomic transitioning context, where does the mining company's responsibility end? We can all say we want this to be alternative energy generation facility, but is it the mining company's responsibility to put all the infrastructure in and build that? Or is it just to get it into a condition that somebody else could come in and do it? And that's where Mike's comments about partnerships and co-development, the idea that Malcolm pointed out, as I've noted a few times in other discussions, understanding who else is out there. Are there local or regional planning groups? Do they have plan developments? Are we looking at national level, regional economic development planning? Those groups need to be incorporated. It's another group that we often forget about. We talk to the mayors, and we talk to the people, we talk to the school teachers, we talk to the indigenous people on their land, who have traditionally, been part of that land. And yet we don't talk to the people who actually do the economic planning for the area.
Yeah. Do you mind if I'm going to try and see if I can, I just wholeheartedly agree with what Jeff and Malcolm are speaking to. And I think one of the things that the industry, so we struggle with is closure and what's the next best land use and who's going to pay for it and that sort of stuff. Fully, that's absolutely true. But I think part of to me, the word it's being used as it's closure, and Malcolm talked about relinquishment, right? Ultimately, it's relinquishment is what we're after, and it's transitioning. So from my perspective, closure is not an objective or a goal. It's the tool to transition, right? It's the means to do it, right? And we're actually in the mining industry pretty darn good at transitioning from one stage and land use to another. So for example, we invest money, we do work, we get permits to do exploration. And then we do all that work, generate more investment and funding in order to transition it to start doing baseline studies. And then we take those baseline studies, invest more money, invest more time, get more permitting, do an environmental assessment. And then we go to permitting. Then we go to hopefully to construction. We transition. And I can't transition from understanding the resource unless when I'm a geologist, an exploration geologist, unless I function and work with another core business, which is the mining engineer. So we're actually really good at working with others who are outside of our core business. What we're missing is saying there are tons of industry around us who are simply looking for opportunities just like us. And if we brought them into the conversation, right, they would have ideas that we didn't even think about. And so we don't need to fund these things. We need to be appreciative of that there's an entrepreneurial person, group, company out there. We just need to create, as Jeff says, the land, safe, stable, or in equilibrium, so that it can be used for that next land use. And let's not take away infrastructure that would actually be useful for that next best land use, right? Transmission lines, transformers, all that sort of stuff. Why wouldn't we keep it there and allow it to be used so that we have a closure vision that connects the thread across time of the development of the mine is not only about the social economic opportunity of the mine, but multi-generational socioeconomic development for multiple land uses for many, many generations to come.
And I think,
Malcolm.
sorry, Dominic, I think, Mike and Jeff are really singing from the same hymn book as myself here, which I'm very glad to hear. And I think just following along Mike's thread, I think that's the exact piece. We're very good at collaborating and working to achieve projects within a mining context. If we can take that same sort of perspective and apply it more broadly to different key stakeholders, we may come up with a better solution at the end of the day, and not just post-closure, but also potentially during mining. Like Jeff has mentioned a few times, the socioeconomic component can actually be one of the most challenging pieces to deal with at closure. And in my mind, I think potentially a way to actually increase the chances of lessening that impact at closure is diversifying, or at least trying to help diversify the economy while the mine is actually operating. Now, where the mining company's responsibility ends, that's a different question, but I think there are potential opportunities if we take, don't get me wrong, I know in terms of tailings, there's a lot of it, and mine waste, and we can't get rid of all of it, but potentially there's some value to produce some construction materials that could be used to, for example, build out regional infrastructure. May not be commercially valuable to the company, but may actually help the company in other ways. reduces the amount of materials that the companies themselves have to deal with and also hold as potential long-term liabilities. And then you could potentially also be starting to create at least a physical foundation for potentially other opportunities to arise. You could also say there's potentially other commodities of interest that a certain company isn't interested in that maybe others are, and engaging with them and potentially co-partnering to mine an area may be able to create more diversified industries. But I think both gentlemen have mentioned some very key pieces in terms of key stakeholders. One is regional planners, which I don't think we engage with enough, but I think there's a lot of potential there. And then also cross industry to potentially unlock other ideas that we just don't see because we are not seeing a particular challenge as a potential opportunity, which naturally another industry would. I will note, just for, I don't know, Jeff and Mike, if you are aware, but South Africa has actually just come out with a proposed new draft. I think it's legislation in terms of the national closure strategy, and it's actually talking about regionalized closure planning, which I think is quite exciting, and it actually has elements of the circular economy and socioeconomic diversification, but not just at closure, but also throughout mining. And I sort of wonder if this may be a potential tipping point for the industry, that other jurisdictions start to go this way. It hasn't been, I guess, approved yet, but it's interesting to see these ideas start to come to the fore.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, Malcolm. I didn't realize that. Thanks for sharing that. And I know you mentioned before, Malcolm, that Dominic, that there are barriers. I do think that there are optimizations that are required from a regulatory perspective. Absolutely, right? But in terms of what we're talking about today here, or what we're focusing on in this last little bit about future land use and collaboration, I'll give, the Policy in the Mines Act in British Columbia, right? The chief inspector can approve any, in BC they call it N land use, but let's use future land use. And it's no holds barred. There's nothing to say that it has to be ecological restoration. So the barrier to doing something different, like we're talking about, it literally doesn't exist. Now, sure, there's things that we need to optimize and all that sort of stuff, but that's very common in almost every jurisdiction that I'm aware of. There's no barrier to collaborating with somebody and figuring out a next best future land use that's beyond mining. I think it's our vision. We're our own barriers. The change that we need to make is us in our approach and how we think about it.
Is the industry being thwarted from being able to exercise its transitioning pedigree from a hysteria that's out there? Is it being unfairly maligned? It was given freer rein to make the changes that needed to be made, or is that over-egging it?
Go ahead, Sam. Sorry.
First of all, I do want to answer that, Dominic, but before I do that, Malcolm said something that was really critical, and I should have said it earlier. Trying to deal with socioeconomic transitioning at the time the mine closes, you've already lost the game. It's way, way too late. You cannot develop the kinds of alternative economy and whatnot if you're waiting until the end. That has to start right at the beginning. Again, the whole concept that Mike brought up of integrated mine planning, we've got to bring that to the table at the beginning. I'm actually working on a project with a client right now where they are here in Nevada. For those of you who don't know, we have lots of sun here. And they have a large amount of property that they're not going to use for the mine. And it happens to be adjacent to a very large solar facility. And they have massive transmission lines into the operation because it's a redevelopment project. And they said, well, let's take some of our land and actually develop it as a solar. So they brought a solar group in. They're going to they figured out how much solar power they can use at the facility. They're going to put that in, and it's only for them. It's all the power is going to go straight to the mine, but then the rest of the land, they're going to put it out onto the grid and sell it. When the mine closes, they'll actually flip the switch on the internal stuff, and that'll become part of the power supply that's going out to the grid. So, people are starting to think about this in the planning process, but it has to start then. It can't be a closure. in terms of barriers, are again, I think it still comes back to the issue of communication. Are we, because essentially there's a level of mistrust, and there's a lot of reason for that. There's a lot of narrative out there that's extremely negative to the industry. A lot of it is, dare I say, a bit self-serving, from some of those individuals and some of those groups, but I think the majority of it is simply a lack of understanding. And as a result, there's a certain level of mistrust. Let's face it, if we look back for the last 150 years, just say in North America, the legacy of the industry is not good if you take it collectively. Mines, long before, mines were making messes in the environment and messing up communities long before the laws protecting those resources actually came into being. And now we're dealing with that legacy. So it's very easy to point at that and say, this is what the mining industry is all about. Well, that's not true, but that's what people see and that's what people hear. And so again, I've always thought that the industry had a great story to tell. If it didn't, I don't think I would continue to be involved in it. And it's amazing. The people who are in the industry are amazing. They're probably some of the most environmentally, socially conscious people that I've run into in one collective group anywhere in the world. They really understand this stuff and they want to do it right. However, they're misunderstood. And I think the main reason they're misunderstood is that we choose not to communicate, we don't know how to communicate, and we don't communicate.
So thank you for that, Jeff. Mike, do we need a bit more stick or a bit more carrot to get things moving? What's your thoughts on that? And with a view to, we'll need to have your final thoughts and last sort of key thinking on this subject.
I think it's just perhaps it's both. But to pick up what Jeff says, it's more communication, it's more dreaming, it's more visioning. Somebody told me a story about my dad one day, is that they described him as being it was not, he uncovered the ability to process cobalt and nickel in the shields of Canada as a metallurgist, not for profit, not for gain, but simply for what it brought to society. And that's what people like Malcolm and Jeff are, right? They're just people like, we just continue to talk about this. It's not for profit, it's not for gain, it's for the good of society. And like Jeff says, I have a tremendous faith in the mining industry, and that includes, the big part, like not just the industry, but all of those around us. That we're going to figure this out. We just keep communicating, keep collaborating, keep trying to understand each other. And to me, that's the way I would move forward. It makes it more fun trying to work together and figure it out all together.
Malcolm, last thoughts?
I think I echo a lot of what Jeff and Mike have been saying throughout the entire conversation. I think one thing I will mention is that, we've made a lot of mistakes as an industry in the past, and through that iterative process, I would like to think that we're learning and improving. I still think there's a long way for us to go. I think the time right now is quite ripe for that, especially with the more external scrutiny from different stakeholders, putting pressure on the industry, forcing us to evolve and change, which we can embrace and make the most of, or continue to do things we always have done. But I think that with the opportunities there to seize the moment and really move to from an era of compliance and environmental management to potential valorization and opportunity seizing. We really need new ideas. We've obviously learned a lot, like Jeff has mentioned, over the years in terms of closure, but we do need new ideas brought to the table to see how we can create a new future, very simply and very honestly. In my opinion, what that looks like, I think, is an exciting chapter to be a part of, and I think, like Mike said and Jeff said, it's a key piece of this is collaboration, not just within the companies, but also with external stakeholders, to see how we can improve.
So, Jeff, winding up things now. Any last thoughts? Anything you'd like to communicate to the audience?
Not really. I think we've covered a lot of the big things. There's obviously more to talk about, but it's been a great discussion. And I think hopefully it's given a lot of people things to think about. Hopefully some of these discussion topics will come up at the International Mine Closure Conference that will be hosted here in Reno, Nevada, in the first week of October. And if anybody's interested, they can just type in Mine Closure 2023 in your browser, and you will find the web link for information about the conference. We're expecting, well, we already know we have about 300 people have already registered. We're expecting somewhere between 500 and 600 people to show up, and we've got some great workshops and field trips. So hopefully anybody seeing this, if they didn't know about it, they'll know about it now. Thanks, Dominic. Thanks, guys.
Wonderful. Well, look, gentlemen, that's sadly all we've got time for, but I want to thank you very much. Mike Okane at Okane Consultants, Jeff Parshley at SRK Consulting, and Malcolm Shang at ArcelorMittal for your time and for your insights. I'm Dominic Hale, and you've been watching Mining Journal's panel discussion on mine closure.